Welcome back, everyone. This is our first Fantasy Labs NHL show of the year. We're going to be breaking down into a four-part series, just highlighting each team from each division and going into the 2017 and 2018 NHL season. So I'm your host, Joe Holka, joined as always with Sean Newsham. He's at PSUFans2 on Twitter. Sean, how you doing, man? It's been a while.
Oh, not too bad. Just getting ready to get started. I saw that DraftKings and FanDuel both posted some hockey contests already for week one on Wednesday. So it's coming. It's going to be here next week. I'm looking forward to get out of the NFL situation and move on to hockey.
Yeah, it's been a grind. We're excited to kind of talk some hockey with you guys. We got a lot of really cool improvements coming to all the tools and the product in general. We're going to be doing a lot more live shows as well. So also joining us is Ryan Sheppard. He's at Donk Show DFS on Twitter. So Ryan, great to have you, man. Excited to finally talk some hockey?
Yeah, I'm definitely excited. I felt like the season kind of crept up on me with NFL just going back a couple weeks ago. It definitely crept up fast.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like we're already going into week 4 in NFL, and now we're just automatically into hockey season. It's just come so quickly. I think it's going to be fun to kind of run through some of these teams. Today we're going to start with the Atlantic Division, and might as well just jump right into it. We're going to start with the Boston Bruins. They're a team that qualified for the playoffs last year but lost to the Ottawa Senators in 6 games in the Eastern Conference, the first round series. So the Bruins didn't really make a ton of splashes in free agency this offseason, but they kind of remained pretty quiet relative to recent years in free agency. So they definitely got a lot of young guys that are interesting to kind of talk about that are going to make a big impact this year. But I thought we'd start just by obviously starting with their top line that was extremely productive last year. Patrice Bergeron, Brad Marchand, and David Pastrnak. And as far as looking at some of those metrics, just from shot volume alone, they were definitely one of the top lines in the NHL last season and one we were targeting quite a bit. So Sean, I'll start with you. Do you think we should expect anything less from these guys as far as shot volume, as far as point production for this coming year?
No, I mean, there's really no indication that would dictate that these guys would slow down at all. I know David Pastrnak had his contract dispute, and I know that they've been handling that all offseason, but there's really no indication that they should slow down. This is one of the best lines in the league last year. I would expect a similar output from them this year, and I would expect them to be really productive again, especially in situations against weaker opponents.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're probably one of those lines that just was piling up those peripheral stats that we like to talk about so much. But Ryan, what are your thoughts on the top line in Boston? Do you think there's going to be much depth outside of them, or do you think it's going to be those guys and then a bunch of younger guys we're kind of not sure about in the beginning of the year?
There's definitely a lot of younger guys on their team. The top line obviously was extremely dominant last year. In preseason this year, they've actually had a young guy named Anders Bjork playing with Bergeron and Marchand a little bit. So I don't know if that's something that'll be short term or something that we can look at for maybe a cheap play heading into the season. But personally, I don't really see why they would break up probably the most dominant line in the NHL.
Yeah, Bjork's kind of an interesting one. He's a guy that played college hockey last year for Notre Dame. He was a 5th-round pick in 2014, so he's a little bit older. He had 52 points in college hockey last year and 21 goals, which is pretty impressive numbers for the NCAA. You're only playing like 30-some games. So I think he's interesting, especially if he starts out super cheap. Will be someone to kind of watch. The guy I really want to talk about is Charlie McAvoy, though. What are your thoughts on him, Sean? He was the 14th overall pick in the 2016 draft. Obviously, we got to see him a little bit in the playoffs last year, but do you think he's going to come in and be a top 2 guy for them on the back end?
Yeah, he's definitely going to be someone that's intriguing this year. There's some reports out there that he's going to come in and get a decent amount of minutes. You could look at someone like Zach Werenski last year, and he could come in and possibly have that impact. He's a young puck-moving defenseman that's a smooth skater. Last year, you saw some younger defensemen come in and stand in, and there's a good possibility he ends up eating a lot of minutes. He came in and had a little cameo for them in the playoffs last year. I think he had like 3 or 4 points in about 6 games. So he came in the crunch time in the playoffs and came in there and produced. So he's definitely a guy that you're probably going to see start out as like a lower type salary on both sites or on all the major sites that you're going to be playing on. And he's going to be someone that's really cheap and is a puck-moving defenseman that might be on the point on the power play. So he's definitely going to be someone you want to monitor where he's playing and who he's playing with and how many minutes he gets and see where he goes from there.
Yeah, do you think there's a pretty decent edge, Sean, in the beginning of the year with some of these kind of lower-priced guys that maybe people aren't super familiar with but are going to come in and play minutes right away?
Yeah, like someone that you'll talk about last year, like a lot of the rookies will be underpriced or mispriced going into the season. For example, last year, I remember this first night of the season, Austin Matthews had his breakout game and had a hat trick, and he was like 5 or 10% owned, and he was at like 4,500 or something really cheap, and it was his low point all season, and from there he just went nuts all year. But so like you'll see guys like that come in at the beginning of the season and be severely underpriced from what they should be because the salaries and the algorithms just don't know them yet. So it's definitely a spot where if you know of young guys that are going to get minutes and get good situations, they're definitely people to target because they're generally going to be mispriced from all the algorithm standpoint.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So Ryan, are you paying much attention to the preseason, or do you think it's kind of too early to kind of figure out what's going to happen with lines? Like you mentioned Bjork. Is there anyone else that's kind of like stood out to you so far before we move on?
There's not really anyone that stood out for me on Boston. As Sean was hitting on, McAvoy is definitely someone I'm very interested, especially early in the season. I feel young guys for NHL DFS often are, their cheap salaries definitely fly under the radar, unlike other sports, because it's such a smaller sport that they definitely get missed, and it's something that we can take advantage of.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's keep this train rolling. We got a lot of games to get to. So the next one is the Buffalo Sabres, one of Sean's favorite teams in the league. So I'm sure he's got a lot to say about them. They fired their coach last year, Dan Bylsma. Now it's Phil Housley and general manager Jason Botterill. So they've done quite a bit of movement already this year as far as some key roster moves right away. They've gone ahead and traded Tyler Ennis and Marcus Foligno on a third-round pick for Scandella and Pominville, as well as a fourth-round pick. But I know, Sean, you wanted to talk about the Nathan Beaulieu trade. What did you feel? How did you feel about that? Do you think he's going to come in and be a good player for them?
Yeah, Buffalo needs someone that's going to come in and play some minutes and also can move the puck. Last year, Ristolainen was playing obnoxious minutes. He was playing like 30 minutes a night, and it's just – you can't expect someone to be playing that much. You need to have some other outlets, especially on the defensive end. And I really like Nathan Beaulieu. He's definitely had ups and downs with Montreal, but he's a young guy that's a good skater that has an offensive game. He could come in and play that role for Buffalo as the second pairing defenseman with an offensive abilities. And he's a guy that could eat some minutes because there's really not very many options in Buffalo. I know they brought in Scandella as well, and I actually like Marco Scandella, but the back end they have kind of overhauled a little bit. They even brought in a guy who has played in the KHL, Victor Antonin, and he's going to come in as well. So there's definitely going to be a lot of changes from what there was last year on the blue line for Buffalo, and hopefully there's some people there that can give Ristolainen a bit of a break from playing 30 minutes a game.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Buffalo last year was one of those teams we were targeting their goaltenders a lot just because they were giving up so many shots. So I think the biggest question this year with them is, are they going to be able to reduce that shot volume against? They were a team that allowed the most shots on goal per game last season at just over 34 shots per game. So obviously that's something that they're going to need to improve. I think the next question is, who's going to be able to score goals at even strength? I mean, they were a team that was pretty prolific on the power play last year, but Evander Kane was basically their best goal scorer. He had 25 goals on 5-on-5 last year, which is pretty impressive. He only had 28 on the year. So is there anyone else, I'll go to you, Ryan, that you think that could score some goals for this team this year outside of Kane, at least at 5-on-5, not so much the power play?
Well, one guy I'm definitely looking forward to watching is Jack Eichel. I mean, he definitely started to take big steps last season. Unfortunately, obviously, he missed 21 games with an injury. But I'm really looking forward for him to take the next step because obviously he's not quite at the same level as Connor McDavid, but we saw that step that he took in his second season, and it looked like Eichel was going to be well on his way. Another guy I'm looking at is not so much for goal scoring, but Ryan O'Reilly's offensive output is always understated because he's known for his penalty kill and his defensive play, but he's got some pretty good offensive ability, definitely playmaking ability. So he's another guy that I think is definitely going to help.
Yeah, I mean, the power play was the best in the league last year at 24.5%. 60 of their 199 goals were scored on the man advantage. So that was the most in the league. Sean, is there anyone else you feel like we need to touch on? We touched on the defense quickly, but is there anyone else you think that's going to have an impact outside of Risto?
I kind of actually like a couple of new additions. Not necessarily Jason Pominville. He's been around Buffalo for a while. He's coming back. But there is rumors that Jason Pominville might run the point on the power play, which would bring in some value. The other guy I like is Benoit Pouliot. Mm-hmm. He's sort of always an under-the-radar guy. If he gets the type of minutes on maybe like a Jack Eichel's wing or maybe a Ryan O'Reilly's wing, and he's going to be a guy that's going to be like $3K at the beginning of the season, he's going to be really cheap on all the sites. So if you go into the beginning of the season and you have someone like Pouliot playing minutes, and I actually have always liked Pouliot's game. I think he's been underrated for a majority of his career. And he just comes out there and he is a decent player. So definitely some people like that. And then, like I said, it's all going to depend on their defense and see who's sort of going to start eating minutes outside of Ristolainen, because there's no way that Ristolainen is going to eat the minutes that he ate last year. So there's going to have to be someone else eating those minutes, or there's going to be someone like Marco Scandella that maybe will play with him that's going to play those minutes as well.
Yeah, an interesting team for sure. A lot of turnover, a lot of new faces. I think it could look a lot different than it did last year. So have to keep an eye on that. So moving on, the Detroit Red Wings. This is kind of a unique situation for them this year. It's the first time since 1990 that they're going to have started the season without qualifying for the playoffs the year before. So that was a 25-season year or run that ended last year, obviously. So Detroit's probably in a rebuilding process that could take a couple seasons. They did sign Trevor Daley in the offseason to a 3-year deal. But is there anyone else that you've seen, Sean, at least as far as the transactions, that kind of stands out?
No, they really didn't do anything. They re-signed Thomas Tatar in the offseason, and then they brought in Daley. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same team with a few younger guys maybe pushing into the lineup. But realistically, what they need to change and what needs to happen for them is they needed the young guys that had good years before last year, a.k.a. Dylan Larkin. Dylan Larkin's got to come back, and he's got to reestablish himself as a very good player, and he's got to go back to the all-star skill level that he played at the year before last in order for them to produce. They just really didn't establish much. So sort of like you said, it's a rebuilding spot for a team that's not used to rebuilding. And I think they're really going to struggle again this year because they just don't have that top-end talent, and it's just not a great mix of players for the most part on their roster.
Yeah, from a fantasy perspective, Larkin saw a dip. I mean, he had 32 points last year, 17 goals, but he's a minus 28 in 80 games. The season before his rookie season, he had 45 points, but he was also a plus 11. Ryan, do you think that was more of a factor of Detroit just not being very good, or do you think that Larkin actually was kind of take a step back as far as the defensive side of things?
I think a big factor of it had to do with just how bad Detroit was. I mean, if you look up and down their roster, you're seeing multiple players that were, minus 19, minus 20, minus 28. I don't necessarily just think it was on him. I do think the team just was really poor in general. One guy that I'm definitely looking forward to see in hopefully full season is Anthony Mantha. He's taken the more prototypical Detroit Red Wings development route. He was drafted in 2013, spent his time in the minors, slowly making his way up. And he's definitely showed different flashes as a youngster last season, and I'm definitely looking forward to him.
Sean, any love for my boy Nick Jensen? He's kind of gone through that route as well. I think he's a guy that he might not necessarily be super fantasy relevant, but I think he stands a chance to be a big part of this decor this year. I think he's going to be a guy that sticks for the whole season.
Yeah, I mean, I think he will as well because it would make sense. He's shown some glimmers of hope in the past, so it definitely is someone that could go out there and produce a little bit. And then you have someone like Mike Green. Like Mike Green has produced in the past. He's not a heavy volume shooter, but we know Mike Green's offensive abilities are there, and you never know. That could be something that they come out and show for maybe a month stretch type of thing. But yeah, Jensen could push in the line, could remain in the line for the entire year. So it's definitely someone that could be interesting going out throughout the year. It's just, for me, Detroit's one of the weakest teams in the Atlantic Division, and they're going to struggle throughout the season.
Yeah, the defensive core, I think, is something that is pretty weak, but there's a lot of uncertainty too. I mean, we'll see what Danny DeKeyser does this year. Last year, he definitely took a step back, but we'll see what Trevor Daley's impact is. I mean, he turns 34 this year. He signed a 3-year contract worth $9.5 million. So, I mean, they definitely paid him, but I still think depth is kind of an issue for this team. We'll see what happens with Cronwall, with Jonathan Ericsson. Both guys have been banged up, but I think who's going to play with Mike Green in that top pairing is super interesting and definitely fantasy relevant. One of the things as far as Detroit and from a fantasy perspective last year is they weren't shooting a lot. It's a team that's kind of prided themselves on just kind of keeping possession, but they were outshot last year for the first time since 1990. So hopefully they can increase that next year. But is there anything else you guys kind of wanted to touch on from Detroit, or can we move on?
No, I'm good with Detroit. Not too excited about their prospects going into the year.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to the Florida Panthers. This is kind of a little bit more interesting team. They've got a lot of really exciting young guys. They have a ton of just talent in the youth, and just in general, they're going to try and recapture that success. They won the Atlantic Division 2 seasons ago, but they had a 6th place finish last year. So a lot of it's going to kind of ride on some of those young guys, the Barkoffs, the Bukestads, Huberdeau. All those guys are under 25 years old. So I think the future is bright for these guys, but they definitely lost some talent. So they're going to need some of those top young guys to take a step. Sean, any of these guys that they picked up in free agency? I know they signed Radim Verbata, which is probably an underrated signing. Anyone else that kind of stands out? They bought out UC Jokinen as well.
Yeah, they bought out UC Jokinen. They have a lot of goals and scoring to replace. Marchessault, Jaromir Jagr, Riley Smith, UC Jokinen are all gone. Those guys scored 72 goals last year for Florida of 205. So they have a lot of goals to replace. Someone that is extremely intriguing coming into the season is Yevgeny Dadonov. He's played in the KHL for years, and he's torn it up. He was a 30-goal scorer last year in the KHL for St. Petersburg, and he's been in the KHL for 5 years. Now, granted, the KHL isn't at the level of the NHL, but it's still a very strong league. So it all depends if someone like him can have their scoring output translate into the NHL game, which is possible, but it's usually going to be a downtick. And I've always been a fan of Radim Verbata's game. If you put Verbata on the wing with the right players, I think that it could be a really good situation. I've always been a fan of the Florida Panthers game in recent years. So, they have a lot of guys, and if things mesh well, this could be a really explosive team.
Yeah, I mean, they expected Bukestad to be a much bigger part of their team last year, but he was kind of slowed down with injuries early in the year and never really kind of got back to that year before. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Ekblad? I think that he could kind of take a step this year. I mean, he showed a good peripheral floor, at least, because he blocks a lot of shots. He shoots a lot. He's a guy that won the Calder Trophy in 2014. Do you think that he's a guy that can kind of jump back into relevance this year on this team?
Yeah, I definitely think so. He's he can do it all. I mean, he can put up some offense. He can block a lot of shots. That's definitely something that I like to see. Their defense in general. I didn't like the move to trade Jason Demers. He was another guy that, decent offensive ability, and they traded him for a 4th-line player. I think Florida's made a lot of questionable moves over the last year. Last season, they a lot of their players are injured, right? Barkov missed 20 games. UC Jokinen was down. Ekblad missed some games, and then they basically bailed on their entire analytical approach, and then losing, Jonathan Marchessault, who was making under $1 million and put up 30 goals, trading away Riley Smith, a lot of these guys they went out and got the previous season. They decided after 1 year riddled with injuries that they were just going to completely scrap everything, bring back Dale Talon, and let him go back to the old way. So a lot of the moves, I wasn't happy with what they made, but looking at their roster, I still think they have a lot of depth and still have a lot of potential this year.
Yeah, like you guys have talked about, 7 forwards that reached double digits in goals last season, but 4 of those guys are gone. You mentioned Marchessault. He led the team with 30, but then he was chosen by the Vegas Golden Knights in the expansion draft. So I think that's a pretty big loss. Sean, any further thoughts on Florida? Seems pretty cut and dry. It's going to be a lot different than it was last year, but hopefully some of these younger guys can step up.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, we know how strong they are down the center with Barkov, Trocheck, and Bukestad. So a lot of it's going to just depend on how the wingers shake out, because you look through the wingers, and the only winger essentially that was there last year that played top 6 minutes at a good clip was Huberdeau. So you're looking at 3 other wingers that are going to step into the top 2 lines that were not there last year. So it's really going to be interesting to see how that team meshes and see who can play well with who and who settles in at what spots. And then, I know you guys talked about Aaron Ekblad. I think Aaron Ekblad's going to come out and have another great year. I've always been a fan of Aaron Ekblad. I think he's a really, really great young player. And I think if he can continue growing his offensive game, he's going to be a great player for us in the fantasy world.
Yeah, one thing they definitely have going for them is depth through the middle. One thing that this team that we're going to talk about next definitely doesn't have a lot of, the Montreal Canadiens. They lost in the first round in 6 games to the New York Rangers last year. The Canadiens just are trying to solve that problem that they have up front now. They signed Jonathan Drouin from the Tampa Bay Lightning as their top kind of acquisition, and then one of their top prospects as well. So, I mean, it's a team that's going to look quite a bit different this year. They just signed Carey Price to an 8-year extension, $84 million. You think he's worth $84 million? Ryan, we'll go to you.
I mean, he's the best goalie in the league, so I don't mind him getting, being the highest paid goaltender, but it's so tough when you see how quickly goalies can kind of, fall from grace. I'm not saying he's going to, because like I said, he is, the best goaltender, top 2 goaltender in the league, but it's just such a big long-term contract that what's he going to be doing in 6 years?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the question. I'm sure it's a little bit front loaded, but Sean, what are your thoughts on Carey Price? Do you think that he's a guy we're going to be attacking quite a bit again this year?
I think that this is one of the most under the radar disastrous teams in the league. The deals they have on contracts, long-term contracts on someone like Carey Price, Shea Weber. Don't get me wrong, Shea Weber's still great, but you're going to get the backside of his career. Carl Alsner, that deal's probably already terrible. This team could be in really bad shape going forward. You look at this roster and you look at the forwards. You see Max Pacioretty. And then you see a bunch of people like Paul Byron, Andrew Shaw, Alesh Hemsky, Torrey Mitchell. These are not great players, and these are guys that are going to have to play valuable minutes for them, like David Schlemko. This team is just not a very good team. Now, that said, if someone like Jonathan Drouin can actually go out there and shine, he's got so much talent, and he just had massive issues with Stevie Y and Tampa Bay that he was held back a little bit. So it's just a situation where Price is always going to be a high-priced goalie because, as Ryan said, he's the best goalie in the league. However, the best goalie in the league and paying the goalie that much money only gets you so far when the skaters in front of him are not very strong.
Yeah, Drouin was an interesting one. He was obviously sent to the American League by Steve Yzerman. Said he wasn't going to play. Then when he did play, he underperformed quite a bit. Just some guys that I know that played against him in that league, they didn't really think he was anything special, but he was definitely a guy that when he wanted to turn it on, could turn it on. We saw that in the playoffs last year. So he's got a ton of talent. The question with this team is how are they going to replace kind of the offensive guys like Radulov, Markov. Radulov obviously has moved on, but Markov is in the KHL now this year. So it's going to be kind of an issue to see if they can kind of fill that role. But does this team even really have a number 1 center? I guess Drouin has already said that he could play center. They've got Alex Galchenyuk. Do you think he's going to be the guy that ends up playing with Pacioretty? I think that's their biggest issue right now is they literally don't have any centermen.
No, I mean, even after you look at Galchenyuk, I mean, there was rumors of them trading Galchenyuk all winter. So, they clearly don't like him very much, but he's okay, I guess. But the problem is you look down the center of their roster and you see a bunch of mediocrity. You don't I don't see a number 1 center on their roster. You just see a bunch of guys who are okay. So it's definitely a situation where Max Pacioretty is a very talented player, but he's not surrounded by a bunch of strength. And even if, let's say, you put Pacioretty, Galchenyuk, and Drouin on the top line, after that you just have not much. So it's definitely a situation where, I don't know, Montreal's outperformed what I've expected from them in the last few years. So it's definitely an interesting situation with Montreal every year.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't really see a playoff team here. Maybe I'll be surprised. Ryan, any last thoughts on Montreal?
I was just going to say their depth down the middle is really atrocious. And, I mean, when they're going to be counting on what looks to be Jonathan Drouin as their number 1 center, someone that has not played center in the NHL yet, or when you're playing wing for the last 2 years, it's going to be a tough transition. Claude Julien's already come out and said that he has no interest in playing Alex Galchenyuk at center. He said that last year as well. Meanwhile, their top line last year, their most productive line was Pacioretty, Galchenyuk at center, and Radulov on the right wing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, okay, maybe he's not the best defensive player, but you don't need to have a guy like a Jonathan Taves as your top line center. If they're producing offense, you can have other lines shut teams down.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's really what's going to kind of set this team back. But we'll see. Maybe some of these younger guys that have kind of been playing well in the preseason will make the team and make an impact. So, yeah, moving on to a team that probably does have quite a bit of upside that maybe people still really don't give them the respect they deserve, the Ottawa Senators. It's probably an unexpected trip last year to the Eastern Conference Final, but I think they're going to be a team that tries to prove that wasn't a fluke this year. They grabbed a couple of guys in the offseason that maybe don't look like blockbuster moves, but a couple of really good role players. Nate Thompson in particular is just a really solid third-line center that'll block shots and kill penalties, and he's been a part of quite a few runs as far as playoff runs for the Ducks within the last couple of years. So, Sean, is there anything else as far as the transactions? I know they did sign Johnny Oduya as well.
Yeah, they brought in Johnny Oduya. Otherwise, they didn't really bring much. And honestly, they don't have tons of young talent coming up for the most part this year either. But when you have Erik Karlsson on the back end playing 30 minutes a night, you can do a lot of things. Erik Karlsson's just such a talented individual. So they didn't really lose much from the team either. And Mike Hoffman's one of my favorite players in the league. I love Mike Hoffman. I think he's severely underrated, and he has been for years. It's just whether they actually let him go out there and shine, because Mike Hoffman a couple years ago was like top 3 or 4 in the league in goals against, or goals for at even strength. Like he was 4th in the league behind like Patrick Kane or something for goals scored at even strength. And the guy gets no power play time when he's just got a cannon. Last year he finally started getting more power play time. But if you run a power play with like him and Erik Karlsson both at the top, running just one-timers back and forth and stuff, that power play could just be lethal. So it's definitely something I want to see. I want to see Hoffman as he continues to grow and get more mature as the years tick by. I want to see him on that top power play unit, because I think he could be a 40-goal scorer in the NHL. That's how good I think Mike Hoffman is. So I want to keep seeing Mike Hoffman produce and become even better and better each year.
Yeah, I mean, Erik Karlsson, one thing that's pretty relevant is that the Senators lost Mark Mathot in the expansion draft as well. He's a guy that's played with Karlsson quite a bit over the past 5 seasons. So it's going to be interesting to see who they put with him. He's kind of a unique player, obviously, extremely offensive, so you need a guy that's going to be able to kind of cover for him quite a bit. Maybe Johnny Oduya can be that guy, but we'll see. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Bobby Ryan, Clark MacArthur? Those guys kind of took a step back last year. They used to be some of the guys we looked to for goal scoring on this team. But, I mean, Bobby Ryan only scored 13 goals in the regular season. That's his fewest in a full season since 2008 when he was a full-time NHL player for the first time. So do you think that he's a guy that could rebound?
I think he definitely could rebound. In the playoffs, he started to show some of his old form in his, early days in Anaheim. I think he put up 15 points in like about 19, 20 games. So his playoff performance was a lot better, but he didn't look that interested in when I saw him in the regular season. Like he did not seem to have, like he's a kind of a big guy that didn't seem to use his body the way he should. But if he plays like he did in the playoffs, I think he'll be able to at least get back to, about 50, 55 points. Mark Stone's one player that I really like on top of Mike Hoffman that Sean was talking about. He's definitely, 20 goal, 55, 60 point player. He's the type of guy that they need to really have step up this year if they want to do the type of run that they had last year as well. And then on defense, Thomas Chabot is another guy that, a lot of people are talking about. He's looked good in the World Juniors. He's definitely if Karlsson's going to miss the first month or so, I think he's going to be a type of guy that they're going to be looking at for some offensive production on the power play. You also made a good point. I think the loss of Mark Mathot is kind of going under the radar. He really allowed Erik Karlsson to do whatever he wanted, and they're going to really have to trust whoever his new partner is. They're going to let Karlsson do essentially what he wants anyways, but it might have a little bit more repercussions with Mathot not standing beside him.
Yeah, I totally agree. A guy like that's going to be jumping up into the play so much. You need to have familiarity with your D partner, and I think that he definitely has had that with Mathot these last couple years. Sean, what are your thoughts on Craig Anderson? Do you think that he's going to be able to provide top-end goaltending again this year?
Maybe. It depends. I mean, it all depends if Eric Carlson and what you get with him throughout the year. Because I tell
Right.
you what, after Eric Carlson on the back end, they are weak. So it's definitely a situation where Craig Anderson's not the best goalie of all time.
Sure.
So it all depends. Like Craig Anderson could go down, and you could have Mike Condon carry the team for a little bit if it happened. Or from a couple years ago, the good old Hamburglar who came in and cost me lots of money by just going out there and being absolutely insane for a few months. So it's definitely possible. It's just a matter of how the season sort of plays out for him, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Anderson's the guy that's had some back injuries too, so that's something to kind of monitor throughout the year. But I mean, I think there's some evidence to say that he can continue to perform well. Anything else with Ottawa guys? I know there's still quite a bit that I guess needs to shake out on as far as like lines and for a lot of these teams, but I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah, that's pretty much it for me for Ottawa.
Okay. All right. Well, next team is the Tampa Bay Lightning. Obviously, they're going to get the return of Steven Stamkos this year, their prized centerman, and also forward Ryan Callahan from injury. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in Tampa Bay. They're definitely looking to try and get back to the Stanley Cup playoffs this year. It's just in general that the loss of Stamkos and Callahan, and they definitely were pretty inconsistent throughout the season last year. They failed to make the playoffs, even though they went 8-1-1 to end the season. They were 1 point behind the Toronto Maple Leafs for that second wild card spot. You think they have a chance to get back to the playoffs this year, Ryan?
Yeah, I do actually. I think injuries really hurt them last year, especially obviously Steven Stamkos. Losing Drouin's going to hurt. Like that's a pretty big offensive loss considering he put up over 50 points, and I don't think Chris Kunitz is going to be filling that gap.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at their top six, there's just so much firepower with Stamkos, Kucherov, Andre Palat, Tyler Johnson. Like, I don't think they're going to have much trouble scoring goals. A lot of it's going to have to do with Andrei Vasilevsky, to be honest. I mean, he's definitely shown flashes in the back end, but now without veteran and Ben Bishop kind of doing a tandem with him, it's a lot of the load's going to be on him, and it's going to be interesting to see if he can really take the next step as one of the top starting goaltenders.
Yeah, it's almost like they've been kind of preparing Vasilevsky for this. The Ben Bishop trade was interesting. Vasilevsky's definitely struggled through the middle of last season. He had one stretch where he lost 6 consecutive games in January, but he was 12-4-2 in his last 18 starts. So after Bishop was traded, he definitely finished strong, a 2.61 goals against average and 0.917 save percentage towards the end of the year. So I think that's pretty impressive. It's going to be kind of depend on how well their back end can play early on the season, obviously. But Sean, we kind of skimmed over some of these transactions outside of Chris Kunitz. Do you like any of these additions? Guys like Dan Girardi signed a pretty decent-sized deal, or anyone else stand out?
That's more I don't like it. Dan Girardi's pretty terrible, honestly.
Yeah.
So they decided to back up $6 million for 2 years on Dan Girardi for who knows what reason, because he's probably below replacement level player. So
$6 million feels like a lot for him.
Yeah, I mean, anything feels like a lot for him right now. Like, I mean, he's just not very good. What I'm really interested in is I want to see if Mikhail Sergachev can get into the lineup for them this year. Mm-hmm. He's a talented rookie. He pretty much dominated the junior circuit a little bit. But, however, so there is a stipulation in the trade they did with him. If he plays under a certain amount of games, I believe it's about 40, there's a conditional second-round draft pick.
Yep. You still there, Sean?
I'm sorry?
We lost you for a second. Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying that if Sergachev doesn't play over 40 games, they get a second-round draft pick. So it's a situation where I feel like I'm not sure what Tampa Bay is going to do because they might want to hold them back a little bit because of that second-round draft pick. However, Tampa Bay is a very talented team, and this team could be a team that goes deep into the playoffs, and they need all the talent they get. So if someone like Sergachev can help them compete and make that goal happen, he's going to be in their lineup. So it's definitely a person I'm interested in seeing. But I really like Tampa Bay. They've been a really good team for a while. They've re-signed everything. Like Ryan alluded to, it all depends on the health of their team. If these guys can stay healthy, this could be the best team in the NHL.
Yeah, I mean, I'll throw this to either of you guys. So Stamkos, he's still relatively young. He's only 27 years old, natural goal scorer, but he's missed 115 games over the past 4 seasons. Last year, he had that torn meniscus in his right knee. Like, do you think he's going to come back and be everything we remember him to be? I mean, he's a guy that probably doesn't have to score a lot 5-on-5. He's just going to sit in that same spot on the power play and score 30, 40 goals pretty easily, wouldn't you think? We'll start with Sean, I guess.
Yeah, like it's an interesting situation because the Kucherov, Palat, Johnson line is so strong. The triplets are just so strong. So you end up having Stamkos falling a little bit behind them, and then their power play could run a bunch of different ways. Like he could even drop off the top power play unit if they want, realistically. I don't expect them to because obviously he's got a cannon of a shot. But I think he is going to take a step back. I don't necessarily think it's going to be because of any of the issues he's had. It's just more going to be because of the other players are also very good around him that might limit some of his opportunities, whereas if they weren't there, he would have all of them.
Yeah, I mean, as far as DFS, there might be people that are willing to kind of attack Stamkos early, but he's probably going to start relatively expensive. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the prices yet, but I mean, it might make more sense to go after some of these guys that we know were good last year. What are your thoughts as far as like what the ownership's going to be like for Stamkos, at least in the beginning of the year, Ryan?
I think it'll probably be high. I mean, people see the name Steven Stamkos, they'll think back to when he was playing top 2, top 3 player. And I think a lot of people are going to gravitate to him. Whereas to be honest, I think Kucherov is the best player on the team now. I mean, obviously there's some bias there because Stamkos did miss the whole year last year, essentially. But I mean, even the year before, he only had 64 points. The goals are still there, but probably quality of line mates, his assists were down. And I don't know, Kucherov's definitely someone that I'm going to be looking to focus on, especially if I anticipate others going with the name value of Steven Stamkos.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree there. So the last team, guys, the Toronto Maple Leafs, they're a team that's definitely young, but they're looking to kind of take another step forward. I mean, they took a huge step last year. Honestly, just kind of rejuvenated that entire fan base. Probably an unexpected playoff berth, but I mean, they have an exciting core of young players for sure. They had a record with 40 wins. It's their winningest season since 2006, 2007. So it's their first playoffs appearance in the last 4 seasons, but they had the worst record in the NHL in 2015 and 2016. So what are your overall thoughts, Ryan? I know you follow this team pretty closely. I'm curious what you think. Do you think they're going to be able to make the playoffs again this year?
I definitely think I think they should be able to make the playoffs, but I don't think they're going to take too much of a step forward in terms of their overall points. I think they're going to finish in the same kind of 6 to 9 range in the conference, just because at the beginning of last year they caught so many teams by surprise, and everyone's going to be kind of expecting them this year. And they also got extremely lucky in terms of injuries. Nobody got hurt. I mean, Morgan Riley missed a few weeks here and there, but all their young players, Matthews, Marner, Kadri, William Nylander, they all played, 75 plus games. So, I mean, obviously I don't want to jinx anything, but they're probably going to get an injury here or there. Their depth is okay, but a lot of their depth is other young players that will have minimal NHL experience. So while I still expect guys like Matthews and Nylander and Marner to maybe take a step forward due to injuries up and down the roster, I just don't think their point total is really going to increase much.
Yeah, so I mean, Matthews led the team in scoring last year with 69 points, 40 goals, and then Marner had 61 points with 19 goals, 42 assists. Just that entire trio, Nylander, you can even throw in there with 22 goals. Sean, if there's one of those 3 guys that you think is the least likely to kind of repeat from last year, who would it be?
I'm going to say Matthews just because 40 goals is a lot. I like Mitch Marner. I think Mitch Marner can repeat what he did. I'm not saying Matthews can't repeat what he did. I'm just saying 40 goals is a high number. I'm sort of with Ryan. I think the team is very good and they're very young. And the thing that people don't realize is they ran really good with injuries last year. They have some depth. It's a lot of young depth. But the problem is their blue line is still not the strongest. I know they re-signed Zaitsev and They have like Jake Gardner, Morgan Riley, but like their defense is young. It's not the best group ever. So if you lose someone back there, you might be a little bit more affected. I'm really interested to see what Patrick Marleau does. He's a guy who I still think has some abilities, and if he comes in and plays on like Austin Matthews' wing, he could come out there and like light things up that people aren't really expecting. He's getting paid quite a bit. I think it's like 6+ over 3 years, but he's a guy that could go out there and put up quite a few points and sort of come out under the radar, because people, when they're thinking about it, they want the Austin Matthews play. They want the Mitch Marner play. People aren't really going to think about Marleau, at least at the start of the season. And Marleau could come in way cheaper than what these guys did last year, because his price tag for the most part last year for San Jose was limited. And if you come in and bring him in and put him on the top power play, top line, and skate him with Austin Matthews, he could be a guy that really produces next year.
Yeah, and you never know. His price could stay there for a while before it's fully corrected, too. We've seen that quite a bit. They're definitely paying him a lot. They're paying him just under $19 million over 3 years. That's not an insignificant amount of money. Ryan, what are your thoughts on the defensive core? I'm curious. Do you think, so the top two pairings are probably Morgan Riley, Hainsey, Gardner, and Zaitsev. Do you think that's strong enough to compete for a Stanley Cup, or do you think that they're still kind of lacking in that area?
I think they're definitely in trouble on the back end. When their bottom pairing is projected to be Martin Marincin and Connor Carrick, that's already a weak back end. Then you get an injury to someone in the top four. Then, I mean, they signed 2 Swedish defensemen, but they're both coming in at 21, 22, 23, 24 years old, but they haven't played any games in the NHL. Their defensive depth in the NHL is bad. Then when you start looking at the American League who will be coming up for them, it's going to be bad.
Ryan's face when you went into that, talk about the defense, was it wasn't too confident of a face there, Ryan.
No, it was not that. I'm not very confident in them at all. I do agree that I don't think Austin Matthews is going to get 40 goals again. But if he's playing with William Nylander all year, I do think he's going to finish with more points. Because I saw more than enough times where he fed Zach Hyman on a wide open net, and then he was either with a slow release or kind of flubbed it. Yeah. And I mean, he put up 40 goals playing with Connor Brown and Zach Hyman for most of the year. And I know right now Babcock is expecting Nylander and Matthews to play together for most of the season. And if they do, I think those two are just going to get a ton of points.
I agree with Ryan on that a lot. If they put him with Nylander all year, it could just – there was enough. I played Zach Hyman quite a few times last year in DFS because Zach Hyman was, free. Yeah. And you needed some relief. It's okay, well, he's going to play 20 minutes with Austin Matthews and play power play time. And then all of a sudden you just watch him just brick shot after shot. And you're like, oh – Hyman, you just should be way better than you are, and you're not. But if he actually gets the time with Nylander and Nylander gets the time with him, it should benefit both of them very much, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Nylander only had 22 goals last year, and it would not surprise me at all if he put up 30. He's got a very underrated shot, and having a guy with Matthews, like I said, beside him all year long.
Hopefully he's not the leading Nylander in the NHL in goals. Let's
All right, guys. Well, it's one of those divisions that, at least on the surface, doesn't seem like it's going to be super strong. But if you had to pick one to win the division at this point of the year, who would it be, Sean?
Tampa Bay for me. I think Tampa Bay is a really strong team. I think they have everything there to be the best team in the league. I don't think any other team in this division has that yet. I think Toronto is the closest to getting there. I think that Tampa Bay is the class of the division, though.
Man, I still think Ottawa is underrated. No one wants to give them a chance. They're in the Eastern Conference Finals last year. They didn't really lose much. They have one of the best defensemen in the league. I think if they get any type of goaltending this year, I think they could surprise some people. Ryan, who's your pick for the division winner?
I was also going to pick Tampa Bay. I just think getting Stamkos. I just think getting Stamkos back when they only missed by 1 point last year. Considering they came 9th with 94 and Montreal won it with 103, I think Stamkos is good enough to bridge that gap a bit. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of Montreal Boston's tough because I think they have a very strong top six, but their depth is really hurting, and to be honest, it's a pretty wide open division.
Yeah.
if you told me anyone between Tampa, Toronto, Boston, Ottawa, or even Montreal won it, I would not be surprised.
Here's my hot take of this show. Buffalo will make the playoffs this year.
Oh God!
I think they're going to sneak in because the thing is Buffalo, when Eichel was healthy, was a playoff team. They've added a lot of decent talent this year with Scandella, with Pouliot. So they've added this talent that they did not have last year to a team that was a playoff team when Jack Eichel was healthy. Once again, this all comes down to him staying healthy. If Jack Eichel plays 82 games, I think Buffalo makes the playoffs. If Jack Eichel plays 50 games, Buffalo will not make the playoffs type of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a certain amount of sense just because I think their defense will be very much improved this year, you would think. But yeah, Tampa Bay is probably the front runner, I would say, to win the division. But so, guys, anything else that you want to kind of get off your chest before we move on to the next division?
No, I feel pretty good about the Atlantic. I think the biggest wild card for me is the Florida Panthers because I think they have a lot of talent and it just is going to depend how much of that meshes for them.
Yep, I would agree. Ryan, any last thoughts?
Nope, no last thoughts.
All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and end it there for the Atlantic Division. If you guys aren't already, be sure and follow Sean on Twitter. He's at PSUFans2. Ryan is at DonkShowDFS, and you can find myself at Joe Holka. Thanks for hanging out with us.